inside our flat-roofed limestone home in the hills of Beit Jala, just to the south of Jerusalem, listening to the sounds of sirens and bombs in Jerusalem during the June War of 1967. My father had gone up the hill to watch from a rooftop as fighting unfolded. My parents had moved to Jordan from Indiana the year before to study Arabic and to work with a humanitarian organization. They arrived full of hope and a commitment to service, instilled in them by their Mennonite backgrounds. Neither of them anticipated a war. I don't recall hearing the sounds my mother heard that June, of course, but I think somehow I learned something on a cellular level about sound and fear, place and identity, violence and belonging. I can only faintly imagine her fear, and the fear of so many women around the world in a war-torn place. I began at an early age, learning to listen, learning to keep quiet, learning to be watchful. A first seed, perhaps. My mother likes to tell this story. When I was just a few months old, my parents drove from Beit Jala to Wadi Kelt, a historic canyon just east of Jerusalem, to visit the monastery of St. George. She remembers how my father hiked up to the monastery, but she stayed in the cool shade at the base of the canyon, where the creek was flowing and the breeze moved through the trees, and I slept peacefully. So she says. I have returned to that monastery many times over the years, sometimes hiking the trails through the canyon. The research and writing of Chapter 5 reminded me of my mother's story and enabled me to revisit a place I've known since infancy. In subsequent years growing up in Nazareth on a hospital compound where my father worked as a chaplain, we marked time by the call of the mosque's minaret 5 times a day, listened to the bells of the Basilica of Mary on Sundays, and knew where in town there were engagement parties or weddings because the music resounded around the hills. We learned, too, the languages of Arabic and later Hebrew, adapting our ears and voices as needed. I listened closely to the doves and pigeons outside my window, knew when the gardener was working below by the sound of his reed flute, and, in 1973, heard the sirens that blared throughout the town during the Yom Kippur War. We listened to the sirens and took shelter in a cave dug into the limestone hill just across the road. It was quiet in there, the limestone flaking from the walls to the loamy floor. As a child, I thought it was somewhat festive, being interrupted from our dinner and needing to put our plates of food onto trays and walk across the street to the damp cave, a cave that also had an altar and chapel tapestries, to join friends from the compound. But this is, I'm sure, entirely too romantic a memory. The truth is, sounds are often alarm calls, and they can instill in us a visceral fear. We learn to keep safe by listening, and sometimes quiet is a comfort. The cool quiet of the forest behind the hospital compound, Kfar HaChoresh, was also a welcome respite from life and death at the hospital. Each spring, we used to load up our green Peugeot station wagon with a footlocker, carefully packed with cookware and food, strapped to the roof along with gallons of water, a tent, sleeping bags, and snorkeling gear, and set off for the Sinai Desert. We would leave Nazareth long before sunrise and chart our progress with the rising sun as we traveled southward through the valley along the western side of the Jordan River. Our destination was usually the remote and mostly deserted slip of land on Dahab's shores of the Red Sea. This was long before the days of 5-star resorts and airport landing strips, well before any census-worthy residential communities beyond the nudist colonies and Bedouin settlements. The sounds of Dahab, the lapping of the Red Sea, the call of the Eurasian collared doves, and the clatter of pots and pans for cooking were muffled by the sand and thatch shelters where we pitched our tent. The sound of the sea itself, where we spent long days snorkeling, had its own watery acoustic signature. Sometimes our vehicle ran out of gas or got stuck in sand dunes. Other times we were robbed in the middle of the night. But to me,